Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Gregory Brew, Analyst with Eurasia Group. Gregory, thank you for joining me once again.
Thanks for having me back on, Brittany.
A helicopter crash over the weekend killed the Iranian president, foreign minister, and other officials. Before we dive into what this means for Iran, what's your reaction?
Well, the accident came as a pretty big shock. It appears to have been an accident. The helicopter was flying through some heavy weather in the mountains of northwestern Iran. The President Ebrahim Raisi and the foreign minister were traveling with a number of other high-ranking officials. They were coming back from a meeting in Azerbaijan, and the helicopter went down in heavy weather. There was a prolonged search and rescue operation, and eventually the wreckage was found, and the president was confirmed dead. So yes, a shock, a surprise. There have been funerals and commemorations in Iran marking the death of the president, and the government does appear to be making plans for a snap election to choose a new president.
I do want to talk about just who Raisi is. We saw throngs of people outside for his funeral procession. He also had the nickname the Butcher of Tehran. So who is President Raisi?
Certainly. Ebrahim Raisi was someone whose history went back to the beginning of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution of the 1970s. He played a crucial role in the regime's rounding up and execution of political prisoners during the 1980s. He served as a judge and an executioner of those prisoners. He had a bit of a grisly reputation within Iran's political system. He was also very much a figure on the rise. He came to prominence in 2016 as head of the judiciary, again, serving as a judge, carrying out Iran's rather strict code of law. He then rose through the ranks and became president in 2021 through an election that was pretty carefully stage managed by authorities, ensuring that he would be selected as president. He was very close to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and very close to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a hardliner through and through, who was also occasionally pinged as a potential successor to Khamenei, who of course is 85 years old and in very poor health. So Raisi was something of a rising star. He was an arch conservative. He was known as a brutal figure, but very much one whose star was on the ascent. And his sudden death, his sudden demise, has thrown the question of Iran's political future into a bit more question. There's a little bit more confusion as to what will happen now that he's gone, both in the near term as far as picking a new president, and also in the medium term as far as who may succeed Ali Khamenei when he does eventually die.
Before we talk about the what ifs and the what's next, you mentioned that he was a leader on the rise. Just how powerful was he in Iran? Was he the most powerful leader in that country?
Oh no, not by any means. I mean, the executive power in the Islamic Republic of Iran is held by the supreme leader. This has been the case really since the beginnings of the regime through the revolution of 1979, when supreme power was held by Supreme Leader Khamenei, and this then passed to Ali Khamenei in 1989. The president's role shifted depending on who filled that role. There have been figures in the past, Hassan Rafsanjani in the 1990s, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad during the 2000s was a colorful figure who occupied the role of president. Raisi really played a secondary role. He followed Khamenei's lead. He did as he was told in many cases, and deferred to both to Khamenei and the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So he was a secondary figure as far as managing Iran's affairs. He did run the civilian government. I mean, the president does play an important role there. But as far as who was calling the shots in Iran, that was and remains the supreme leader Khamenei.
He's a secondary leader. You mentioned he does have or did have a grisly reputation. Can you talk a little bit about what Iran looked like under his rule?
Certainly. So he became president in 2021, as I mentioned, through an election that was pretty carefully stage managed. The authorities wanted to ensure that he emerged as victor in that election, so they went to great lengths to make sure that he didn't really face any significant competition. The result of that election, however, was very low turnout. Iranians generally started to see these elections as sham affairs. Turnout has been low under Raisi. Also, as president, he wasn't really very successful. The economy has done very poorly. There is widespread corruption. Obviously, there hasn't been a new deal, a new nuclear arrangement with the United States, so sanctions have remained very much in place. Living standards have been dropping. There have also been multiple crises that have occurred under his watch, including the regional crisis that Iran currently finds itself in. It, of course, is in a state of heightened confrontation with Israel, occasional confrontation with the United States. Raisi's reputation, other than being sort of a grisly ideologue who was close to Khamenei, he was generally regarded as incompetent, as a poor leader, as someone who didn't really have a great handle on the position of president. So his departure, while there are, as you mentioned, large crowds turning out for the commemorations and for his funeral, I think in general, there aren't too many folks who are sad to see him go.
I do want to talk about those multiple crises unfolding under his watch. As you mentioned, does this impact them at all? I'm talking about the Israel-Hamas war, as well as the Houthis, Hezbollah, because Iran has backed Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah.
Absolutely. So Iran's foreign policy is unlikely to change. And that gets to the point I made earlier, which is that the president doesn't really have a whole lot of say over that foreign policy. It remains largely in the hands of Khamenei and officers in the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Raisi supported these policies. He was close to these other groups in the resistance front. And whoever succeeds him as president is likely to maintain the same policy. Iran finds itself in a precarious position regarding the war in Gaza. It, of course, fired on Israel directly for the first time in April and has promised to do so again if it comes under attack. So the security situation in the region remains precarious. It remains quite unstable. So for Iran, for Iran's government to now have to plan and carry out a snap election, it's happening under not the best circumstances, and it suggests that instability could increase without really any warning in the event of another unexpected crisis.
Those snap elections, as you mentioned, are happening under a cloud of conflict. What do you think the post-Raisi Iran will look like?
Well, I think the authorities, including Khamenei, will work hard to manage this election as they managed the election of Raisi in 2021. We won't really see any significant changes. There are moderates and reformists who are active in Iran's political scene who will try to run for president and try to put themselves in a position to carry out reforms and changes that are badly needed in Iran. I think there's a general consensus that the Iranian political status quo is untenable. However, the authorities and Khamenei will work to exclude those figures. The election to replace Raisi will be managed, it will be choreographed to some extent, to make sure that another hardliner with close ties to the leader, close ties to the IRGC, is selected to replace Raisi. There are a number of figures, of personalities in the political spectrum who might very well emerge as likely candidates. We'll know a little bit more in a few weeks once the candidates have been announced. But I would expect very little change. The death of Raisi will likely only prove to be a hiccup in terms of the near term, though there could be larger, longer term consequences.
The State Department released a statement on his death, and I want to read it in part. It reads this: the United States expresses its official condolences for the death of Iranian President Raisi. What are your thoughts on this statement?
Well, I think it kind of speaks to the Biden administration's general approach to the U.S.-Iranian relationship, which, if I had to sum it up in one phrase, would be to not rock the boat. The U.S. and Iran remain in a confrontational stance. The United States has not ended its sanctions policy. It remains in confrontation against Iran. It remains in opposition to Iran. There are ongoing U.S. military operations against the Houthis, who are a major Iranian ally. The United States carried out a number of airstrikes against Iran's allies in Iraq and Syria. So, of course, there's no increase or thaw between the U.S. and Iran. That being said, I think the Biden administration wants to do what it can to avoid escalating tensions with Iran. And this brief message to note the death of Iran's president kind of goes to that policy. The United States is trying to improve the state of diplomacy with Iran. There was reports last week of another round of informal talks, indirect talks between U.S. and Iranian officials in Oman. The United States is still very concerned about Iran's nuclear program and is looking for ways to mitigate that risk. So I think the Biden administration is still approaching Iran from the point of view of, we're not going to be friends, but we're going to try to avoid action that escalates the confrontation and search for ways to improve the relationship, albeit slowly and over a longer period of time.
Gregory, in this conversation, you described Raisi using words like grisly, secondary figure, incompetent, amongst others. So what do you think his legacy is going to be?
If I had to sum it up in one word, it would be failure. Raisi was set up to be president. He was promoted to his position. He was backed by the real power brokers in the country, including the supreme leader, Khamenei. He was put in a position to exercise authority as president, to burnish his credentials, perhaps with a view towards eventually making him the supreme leader. And he broadly failed at that task. His presidency was noted with repeated failures. It was marked by crisis. The economy continues to do very poorly. There has been a broad increase in popular dissatisfaction. There was, of course, the profound wave of protests that struck in 2022 in the aftermath of the death of Mahsa Amini, which has brought the issue of hijab to the forefront of Iranian politics, an issue around which the regime continues to struggle. And he died in a freak accident that could very well have been the result of his own miscalculation. There remain questions as to why he or others with him chose to fly through particularly heavy weather in an old helicopter. So he goes out sort of tarnished, I would say. His reputation has been significantly diminished by his time as president, and he may very well go down in history as the worst president the Islamic Republic has seen to date.
Gregory Brew, per usual, I appreciate your insight, your expertise. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on.